Good evening, everyone, and for those that are regular attendees at the Dean's Lecture Series, welcome back. And for those of you that are new, welcome especially to you. This is a special event indeed, where Professor Susan Wright gives what we call her inaugural professorial address. It's the first time she presents a public lecture on behalf of the Dean and the faculty. But let me tell you something about Susan Wright. She's actually been here for some time now. She was appointed as the Chair of Arts Education in February 2010. She succeeded Professor John O'Toole, and I mention that because he was Australia's very first Professor in Arts Education, and Susan follows that. Recently, Susan has taken that role with the leadership of the UNESCO Observatory in Arts Education based here at the university with colleagues, and indeed the only one in Australia. She has an impressive academic record indeed, but life started as a primary school teacher in 1973, and if we wind the clock forward about 20 years, where she's with the Queensland University of Technology, she was there from 1991 to 2003, and in the last few years, Director of the Centre for Applied Studies in Early Childhood. She then made a transition to Singapore, where she started life as an associate professor there in the early childhood and special needs education group, and then transitioned to be head of that group from in 2006 to 2009. She's attracted enormous funding and has over more than $3 million worth of funding, and 2 books that she's written and 4 books that have been edited, and a number of monographs and over 60 refereed papers and also book chapters. Susan Wright has focused her research and teaching on children's meaning, making and the arts. Some of her key research projects have included topics such as children's musical compositions using electronic keyboards, literal and metaphoric symbols in children's drawings of happiness and sadness, and children's interpretations of visual and musical metaphor in adults' works. Her publications, which have stemmed from this focused attention to children's verbal, non-verbal and embodied learning, are seminal in the field. The presentation this evening stems from one of her more recent books, Understanding Creativity in Early Childhood, Making Meaning and Children's Drawings. Meaning making and children's drawings. The bottom line of this research is that engagement with the symbol systems of the arts should be central to how we conceptualise teaching and learning. Not because it improves learning, but because it is learning. A strong rationale is presented for why the arts should take this preeminent position in the schooling process. So tonight's lecture, and there is its title, will tell us more about that. But before I hand over to Susan, I do want to particularly welcome Professor Barry Cunningham, who's the Dean of the Victorian College of the Arts and the Melbourne Conservatorium of Music, and I'm delighted, Barry, that you are here. So will you please join me in welcoming Susan to the lectern to deliver her professorial address.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Professor Rickards, for this opportunity, and thank you all for coming to share in this important topic, and I look forward to engaging with you about it in the future as well. This image that I begin with here, I'm putting up as a metaphor for the arts. I think we'd agree that the arts are colorful, aesthetic-based, and abstract in their domains of a cognition. There's something about the arts that touches us at a visceral level. Today, the arts are found in the finest galleries and performance halls in the world, to everyday art, such as this painted cat. At a fundamental level, the creation and communication of meaning through the arts has always provided a powerful medium for shaping our understanding of ourselves and our worlds. The 4 main artistic media, music, visual arts, dance, and drama, beat the arrival of the wheel by 30 millennia. John F. Kennedy once summed up the importance of the arts when he said, "The life of the arts, far from being an interruption or a distraction in the life of a nation, is very close to the center of a nation's purpose and is a test of the quality of a nation's civilization." Yet the arts in many nation states have almost always had a tenuous relationship to schooling. The constant need for reasserting the value of the arts is a peculiar problem of arts education and not found in disciplines such as mathematics and science education. What's more is that arts education is prone to shifting views, largely in association with the perceived need to justify their existence in the schooling process. Three streams of influence in how the arts are viewed in education have been forwarded by Efland and other authors who've followed on from this. One has to do with Reconstructionism, where the arts are seen as being important for transforming both individuals and society. Another is Expressionism, or vehicles of expression and imaginative work. And Scientific Rationalism is the third, where the arts are seen in relation to knowledge, aesthetic experience, and cognitive function. But more controversial debates center around these two binaries. The instrumentalist argument justifies the impact of the arts based on academic achievement and other non-arts outcomes. And the intrinsic arguments rationalize aspects of learning that are seen to be inherent in the arts, such as aesthetic experience or artistic habits of mind. These debates have led to a rhetoric that centers on proving that the arts do something, that they have an effect on something else, such as enhancing the goals of education and schooling. Advocates for the arts get caught up in striving to demonstrate academic achievement, civic engagement, social cohesion. And this rhetoric of effects is based on a logic that, in arts education, there is a definable, observable, and measurable set of inputs and outputs. Yet this logic fails to account for the fact that encounters with the arts occur within the open systems of the social world. The arts are almost never repeated in exactly the same conditions, nor with the same results. A more appropriate position, therefore, might be to focus on the arts and education as cultural processes, where meaning is negotiated and co-constructed through patterns of interaction and situated learning in specific contexts, and where artistic forms and practices evolve within both symbolic and material conditions that are not predefined, and focus on the conditions that shape experience more than the outcomes of that experience. Such is the orientation that I have used in approaching two research projects that I'll discuss tonight. Both projects were ethnographic, deep, and prolonged, and involved 5 to 8-year-old children. And tonight I'm focusing mostly on the visual arts. But the projects also had interactions between a child and an interlocutor on a one-to-one basis. The interlocutor focused on what the child was doing, saying, thinking, and learning, and served as a type of playmate in this experience, to enrich and extend the child's playful experiences, but to allow the child to take the lead and to do most of the following if possible. The interlocutor also focused on the purpose and the function of the meaning-making that was being created. A line of inquiry that underpins both projects is how various modes inform and enrich each other in the process of semiosis, or the process of meaning-making. And both projects also began with provocations. One study focused on asking the children to draw what the future might be like. That project was basically emphasizing the aspect of creating artworks. The second provocation was asking children to describe happy, sad, tranquil, a difficult concept which I'll come to, or angry art in relation to music of the same emotions. That was a different process in that it was responding to existing artworks. A particular emphasis was on the relationship between verbal and nonverbal meaning-making, and the theory that images, rather than simply language, is processed in our minds and in our brains, but also A very important third component of the studies was on the body-based aspects of cognition. The theory of embodied cognition is that thinking depends on aspects of the body, not just the brain. And there are three phenomena that I'd like to mention tonight that have motivated research on embodied cognition. The first has to do with gesture. We typically gesture when we speak to one another. And gesturing facilitates not just communication, but language and cognitive processing itself. Watch someone talking on a mobile phone, for example, and particularly hand-free devices. They'll be giving directions on how to get to the restaurant that they're standing outside. They'll be emphasizing something, through their dramatic language, etc. But the fascinating thing is that even though we're not face-to-face, we perform as if the gestured communication can be seen. Gesture is linked then not only to language and emotional processing, but also to spatial-temporal reasoning relative to the environment. So a key focus of my research on children's thinking has been a close attention to children's gestures as they created or described art, because that in itself had some meaning. A second aspect of embodied cognition that I think is very important is the issue of body, environment, and remembering. We all remember more effectively by using our bodies and even parts of our surrounding environment to do two things: to offload cognitive storage and to simplify the nature of the cognitive processing itself. So for example, if this boy who's playing with a toy truck were to lose his truck, he would probably find it in his mind rather than retracing exactly where he was by doing things like reenacting being in the space where he last used the truck, remembering actually touching it and moving it, visualizing the event of playing with the other boy, and also visualizing the surrounding context. This involves spatial-temporal reasoning. And this integrated style of reasoning was quite visible in the drawings that were created by the children or described by the young children. A third issue, which is perhaps a little bit more contentious, has to do with mirror neurons. Mirror neurons has attracted significant interest, but sometimes quite controversially. The theory is that there are mirror neurons that fire not only when we undertake an action, but do so when we observe others undertaking a similar action. Some of the research has focused on monkeys or apes or whatever, where, for example, one monkey might be picking up a nut to eat, and the other monkey watching gestures or does the same sort of thing. Now, whether we're talking at a neurological level or simply empathetic, the arts do provoke emotions in humans. We all know, for example, what it's like to feel a lump in our throat when we're at a film and somebody's crying, or an actor on stage. But at a more abstract level as well, we have profound emotional responses to music, art, poetry, and dance. For instance, such instances are conveyed through the symbolic devices embedded in the composition, in the painting, in the literature, in the performance. The studies I'll discuss here demonstrate that children do embody the qualities of the drawn characters and events that they're depicting, and they empathize with the content of the art, often elaborating with imaginative narratives. Have a look at this drawing for a second. I need to pick up a device that I forgot. As is shown here, depictions on paper involve children in simulating actions, body sensations, and feelings. Can you work out what's happening in this artwork? Nobody's going to volunteer? Well, it's a semi-trailer come taxi. And the drivers hook up to the ceiling of the taxi and taken to the roof so that they can have a little bit of a snooze. That's why they've got the ZZZ behind their names, etc. Right? And this eight-year-old boy engaged with this drawn character and the events of the story. For example, he talked about the Sky Patrol in the top right-hand corner, preventing the airplane from ramming the helicopter. And you see the ramming lines at the back, etc. And the semi-trailer driver is actually using a remote control to parcel out hot and cold colors from the sun to warm or cool the cab. You see the little rating lines at the back, right? There are many other aspects we could talk about in this drawing as well. But what I want to point out here is that the boy brought his content alive through icons to clarify his meaning. He used whoosh lines behind and under the surveillance vehicles to demonstrate movement, right? He used zigzag lines between the semi-trailer, the sun, the vehicles, etc., to symbolize radar that was connected to the surveillance cameras in the dirt. And he even put little dots on each of the vehicles to show that they're all connected. They could all connect and talk to each other, whether they're flying or wherever. Picasso said once, painting is just another way of keeping a diary. For those who know how to read, I have painted my autobiography. And I think this is the essence of saying that symbol making itself is the essence of being human. Art, which is just a graphic symbol system, is a vehicle for human communication and comprehension of complex meaning. People draw and paint to know, right? To create and to express abstract ideas about themselves and about their worlds. Symbol making captures sensory modes in emotional and embodied ways. Goodman said this similarly when he said, what we know is felt in our bones and nerves and muscles, as well as grasped in our minds through the invention and interpretation of symbols. Vygotsky described this as sign and tool mediated action. Merleau-Ponty emphasized that perception and representation are structured by the acting body in its purposeful engagement with the world. Vygotsky also claimed that the practical activity of drawing develops the mind because drawing is goal-directed, and where the creator chooses the content and the form of the work to generate signs that have meanings that other people can interpret. There becomes an emotional relationship between the artist and his or her art due to the embodied nature of the art-making process itself. I'm sure you can work out what's going on in this one. This drawing illustrates how visualization is a form of sensory motor reasoning. Motoric thought and feeling are projected onto the page through signs that stand for this event, right? Cognitive linguists also define perceptually grounded concepts in terms of image schemas. One schema, for example, is source, path, goal, which is being depicted here. The gun, which is the source, yields a bullet and makes a dotted line or a path to the criminal on the roof, which is the goal, who in turn leaves a visual schema of his falling through space. But I find it interesting that the boy didn't just go straight down. He has observed that when people dive off a cliff, for example, you go out first and then down. But in the kind of bringing this alive, he audiated it all by gesturing and using onomatopoeia. He shot by going, pew, right? He went, ah, as he fell, and he went splat when he landed, right? Similar embodied cognition is illustrated here by this 5-year-old boy who's exploring how to make blocks move in a domino kind of effect. Early in his life, as an infant, this boy also likely learned about gravity and distance by repeatedly things like tossing things off his high chair and watching the vertical trajectories as they fall, how far an object drops, how long it takes, and what happens at the point of impact. Drives parents insane, but that's learning. Embodied cognition and schema theory are grounded on the view that concepts are built in children's minds and are based on the conclusions that children draw from these experiences. Here's an example that I find rather amusing to some extent. But the concept of gravity and movement and distance are depicted graphically by this 5-year-old girl who is in a suspended state because she's jumping on a trampoline. And researchers talked about that when children draw someone in a diagonal position, it's as if they're partway up and partway down, like falling off a bed, etc. Now, the spatial-temporal relationships between herself in the foreground and her friend who's standing at the trampoline small in the background depicts a change of location, such as landing and rising and landing repeatedly. And it reminds me of that kind of in-your-face kind of depiction that she's got there, as if she's zooming into a camera and coming back again. It also kind of reminds me of that meerkat commercial on TV. I don't know if you see it. I love the meerkats are, I don't know, it's about insurance or something. And at the end, inevitably, the meerkat comes close up to the camera and goes, right? It's like that. She's like, hi, back, hi. So she's showing these types of body schema, and some of these things are separating, connecting, etc. And body schema are found in children's movement patterns in their play. For example, if I'm the infant and my mother's here and my father's sitting at that table here and I've got a toy, I run over to the father and I give the father a toy. I take another toy and I run back to the mother and I give the mother a toy. And a few minutes later, as an infant, I'm drawing back and forth. And that is showing the relationship between what the body has just done. And that's called a transportation schema. Here we have a close-up of a drawing where a child, a 6-year-old boy, drew a schema of over. Do you think that's 1 dog or 3? It's actually 3. It's a single police dog in training, learning how to go over the slide. But it's like an animated cartoon where he's drawn just the main things that the other cartoonists will come along and draw the in-betweens for him. But he's got the key kind of positions. So in this large-scale creating art research that I'd like to discuss, I looked at drawing processes as being representations of spatial-temporal schema and embodied cognition. And there are 3 key principles that I'd like to feature about the symbiotic relationship between graphic, embodied, and narrative forms of semiosis. I'll have 4 examples of each of these 3 things. 1 being graphic assembly of actions, 2nd, enactment of meaning through the body, and the 3rd, the expressive narrative to enliven the artwork. So here we see an example of a little girl chasing her dog. And we can tell that she's chasing because, like the girl jumping on the trampoline, she's off the ground. It gives it a sense of energy or a vibrance. But as well, if you look at the angle of her eyes and the positioning of her limbs, it's as if she's going forward with the dog. And these are subtle things, but for a 5.5-year-old child, she is trying to show the embodied nature of this experience. Similarly, the children will represent sequence of events. And what I've done here is actually storyboarded a single drawing. I split it as if it were 2. On the left-hand side, you'll see that we've got the event of a man, making a road. And on the right-hand side, children crossing the road to go to school. But children will often be able to depict on one page more than one thing happening, such as this. First, we have the boy taking off in his spaceship to go for joyrides. And notice there are icons of jet fuel behind him to show that he's moving. His body's in profile to show that his hands are on the console, etc. Then he plants a tree in the soil near Australia because it's his earth, right? And you see that he's in an upright position and he's touching the flag. So again, it's all showing that these gestural connections are happening. And the third thing is he struggles with trying to show a compass. And even though he's got the letters wrong, etc., you can see he's got 4 orientations, etc., which shows his relationship of his embodied self and his place in the environment. Now, he's only just over 6 years old. And the 4th thing having to do with assembling graphic actions has to do with indexical terminology. In human communication, when we refer to something, we often use very ambiguous terms like, oh, that thing over there, will you get that thing for me? Or that person, right? And we don't necessarily know exactly who we're talking about. And these indexical terms they indicate something else. Now, when children draw, they use these indexes to refer to things like location, time, identification, organization. So if we want to understand what children are talking about in their art, we must attend to the indexes that they're using and try to see what they're referring to. This 5-year-old boy, for example, uses indexes to explain spatial-temporal relationships when he's giving his mother a diamond, which is in his left hand, yellow, which he found at the waterfall, and he's giving it to his mother. And he said, see this, meaning us, in the foreground is where we climbed up. It's about as high as Brisbane. I'm not quite sure what he means, if maybe he's on top of Mount Cootha or something, and then he says, see, it's the waterfall in the background. It's very small because we're very far away from it. He's 5, right? And then he entered the artwork to reenact the event iconically. in the waterfall that's in that boxed framed area, there's the two of them in the background. He says, I want to show you how my mom got across the waterfall to me. And he takes his fingers and he puts them in the page to walk on the white bits, which is the land. You probably remember doing similar things when you were a kid with pillows on the carpet, etc. Similarly, now moving to the second thing about enacting the meaning with body, you can probably work out that this is an Olympic event and the Australians are winning and they're standing on the podiums, etc. But when this boy drew the Olympic medalists, he physiologically enacted this grasping of the Olympic medal. When he was drawing them in place, it's like he was watching to see how his hand worked. And he said, here they are, getting their medals. Now, that's a very subtle thing that a lot of people probably wouldn't even notice, but it is part of that cognition that I was talking about before. Children also use descriptive action to locate things. This 6-year-old girl used descriptive action and gesture to move her hand across the road of the drawing to talk about how the koala came down from the tree and tried to make its way across to the leaves. But unfortunately, it got run over by a car on the way. Iconic dramatization as well is seen in this 5-year-old who entered the drawing too. He enacted himself walking up the steps. He drew the picture, and then he walked his fingers up the steps. And then he said, put my name there, Reuben. And then he also enacted digging in the page, and he took his finger and he dug into the piece of paper to show that he's digging with his thumb. Now, like all children, this boy regarded the spatial framework of his page as the environment, right? In fact, oftentimes children say, if the interlocutor said, well, where do you live? Oh, over there. They gesture off the page as if it's like, this is the map or whatever. And he said, I can't do it all, meaning the house. I can't do the whole house, so I'll just do the stairs. And the stairs basically functioned as a narrative bridge to stand for him leaving the garage to go to the stairs to walk into his house. And what I find interesting about this spatial aspect of this is that it's like a photographic zooming again onto the pertinent symbols. It's sort of like a diagrammatic shorthand. Again, use of icons, but I find this example interesting. This girl's nearly 6 years old, but she drew herself as a policewoman. And you can probably see the signs that indicate that, yes, I'm a policewoman, you know. But what's interesting about it is that she has 2 handcuffs. One handcuff is in her hand and touching the gun of one of the criminals who she's capturing. But she can't catch the other guy, right? So what she does is she suspends that handcuff in space. And we've already talked about a suspended state as being an animated version of this, right? And but the other thing that I find interesting is not that it's just suspended, but she adds then 3 little dots above the handcuff, right? You can see some people nodding like, I get that, right? Because it functions similar to dotted lines of the falling man on the rooftop, right? It's kind of implying a loop around to the green guy on the other side, as if she's wrapping around the page. And the artist did describe this narratively, but couldn't grapple with it graphically. So I think she just kept it as a shorthand version. And in fact, if she were to make dotted lines all the way across the page, it would ruin the picture, right? And children do make such decisions. The third issue has to do with the expressive narrative. And vocalisms and onomatopoeia are what I'd like to feature here. This 8.5-year-old boy used expressive narrative to enliven the artwork, right? His drawing is quite elaborate narrative about space age in the year 2050. You've got gravity machines, you've got spaceships, force fields, a mutated alien floating around at the top with a jetpack on his back, you know. And the aliens can use the space warp and all sorts of things, right? But he uses a lot of vocalisms in this, right? And vocalisms are emphases in change of pitch, volume, speed, etc. And in so doing, he gave a location index to show, for example, the spatial relationships between Saturn in the top, Earth, and Earth's moon. And when he talked about Earth, he said, and Earth is all the way back here, right? And again, we might take this as granted, but that is his way of saying this is so far back, right? But he also used onomatopoeia or sound effects to accompany the actions that were used. For example, these cars that are floating around in space end up going over here. And as you see, they've had an accident. And now instead of being powered on grass, they're powered on fire, right? And they're falling to the ground. And what they're trying to do is get to this landing dock, but they miss. And you see this squiggly line that shows, and he goes, ah, crash, right? Again, a fleeting second of expression, but you can see the embodied nature of that working with his story. This child used repeated words in a similar way. This is about Mr. Grouch. Mr. Grouch has this beautiful castle, right? But he's frustrated because these trees that he's planted, the fruit bats continuously come and eat the fruit from his trees. And he says, the fruit bats just keep coming back and back and back, right? Again, a way of emphasizing. I want to read the full transcript of this, which isn't very long, but to illustrate the figurative language of this 8-year-old boy. He says, it's a philosophical depiction of pollution, and he's very reflective about this. He said, there's going to be lots of cars, trucks, and motorcycles, noise pollution. And a lot of our seas won't be as nice as they are now because of us. Because whenever we get more buildings, we start not caring about what we already had. Because all the smoke would cause a lot of acid rain because of these electricity centers and the smoke coming out. And these trees are in the far distance. And these little things are birds flying around and a waterfall. And I'm going to put a sign there that says they're going to be gone soon. And that's going to be the other waterfall. And I'm going to draw some dead trees. We're not looking after it. And it's mainly our fault, not the animals. Humans have been cutting down trees and looting, taking other people's treasures, because they've worked hard all their life to keep the parks a long time. They wanted that, but the government didn't listen, and now they've got that. There's a dead bird over there. There's 2 people walking here, but there's none there because they won't go. They don't want to go there. Now, what I want to point out is not just the language that he used, which was very embodied, but also the visual metaphor. You notice the 2 parks are surrounded by kind of like thought balloons, right? One is blue, one is black. He used color and other aesthetic elements to actually metaphorically show or juxtapose 2 binaries. Blue, black to show life, death, upright, slumping to show healthy, dying, foliaged and barren trees, and flying and dying as contrasting concepts. Metaphors are important for our thinking. Philosophers, linguists, and psychologists have all contributed to understanding the role that figurative language plays in cognition. Some key writers on this are Lakoff and Johnson, and the book Metaphors We Live By, where they say that metaphor actively structures cognitive processes concerning space and time. And I think we all know what we mean when we say that we're stiff with fright, right? Or light as air, or depressed, right? These are common expressions found across all cultures, right? Metaphors are grounded in our bodily experience. As Twyla Thought claimed, metaphor is the lifeblood of all art. Well-known examples of Lakoff and Johnson is the economy is in a hole. And what this metaphor captures is the abstract notion of us having to visualize the economy is in the whole. It involves mapping one domain, the economy, onto another, a whole. And to understand this metaphor and how we're going to fix the economy requires a mental engagement with our muscular system, right? The embodied experience or energy of actually enacting, reaching into this hole and grabbing this very heavy thing and pulling it out to get us out of this debt, right? This type of thinking is common when we use not just metaphors, but in general. So I want to emphasize that narrative metaphor and embodied meaning is important, not just in arts, but in cognition in general. Because the stories that we are told and the stories we tell ourselves and about ourselves are important in terms of how we come to impose order on our embodied experience. How we construct and make sense of events and actions in our lives. How we establish structure, predictability, and coherence in life. And how we engage in the dynamic processes of claiming identities. Turning experience into narrative seems to be a fundamental feature of the human drive to make meaning, whether that be visual or verbal, fictional or non-fictional, or literary or non-literary. That metaphor can come in any mode. I want to shift attention away now to the second one where children are responding to art, because there are a lot of metaphoric kind of aspects that come through. In this second study where children looked at the artworks of adults, they constructed narratives, which was a very significant component and quite unexpected. There was close to 100 children, again, between the ages of 5 and 8, from balanced groups of boys and girls, etc. But what we did is we had like artworks like from Lily's plastic purse. And they were sort of like postcard size, and we laminated them, and we laid them out, all 12 of them on the page. And the kids could touch them, lift them up, move them around, whatever they wanted to when they talked about it. These illustrations come from children's books, dance photos, paintings, drawings, woodcuts, etc. And I'll show you some examples in a minute. And we wanted them to tell us, which ones do you think are happy? And they'd say, well, this one's happy, and so is this one, and this one. Okay, why do you call them happy? You know, what is there about them? Or there may be a combination of these emotions. And then ultimately, we played music and said, which music goes with these artworks? Do you think that they were the same responses? We started with the Ekman database of facial expressions because we wanted to clarify the meaning of the terms happy, sad, tranquil, angry, but also so that they could get used to using images and lifting them and discussing them, etc. So here we have, I'm going to show you 4 examples of the emotions. This was intended to be a happy drawing, and in fact, it's called Happy Winter, etc. It's from a children's book. It's a common event that they would be able to relate to. But we also wanted to go a little bit more abstractly, but also in an embodied sense where they might be able to empathize with the woman falling into the arms of the man. We've hoped that this would be sad, but potentially it could be seen as tranquil. There's bridges across are very hard to know. This was intended to be a tranquil painting, and this was intended to be an angry painting, but believe me, it's hard to get angry paintings. So when children listen to music, and there was solo flute and synthesizer, they selected the artworks that went with the music, and to say why, we noticed which ones they selected, in what order they chose them, for example, and the comments that they made verbally, and any somatic content. Oh, it's like, and inevitably they did these sound effects and stuff to explain what was going on in the artwork. Most of the artworks were classified similar to the way in which we would perceive them. The children would say, that was happy, that was sad, etc. So I tried this with my students and other people as well to get, adult responses to it. It was the shades between sad and tranquil, understandably, were quite blurred. But the intriguing aspect is that children imagined their own narratives for each of the artworks, whether there was music or not. But particularly when there was music, that was very deep and rich when it was coupled with the sound. The artworks in particular were seen as tranquil or sad on their own, but when children selected music that went with it, sometimes they shifted. And in fact, some artworks had all 4 emotions, which I found quite remarkable. I want to play the music that went with this most contentious artwork from a children's art book, Japanese artist, and the music that we expected to be tranquil, and the comments they made when they listened to it. You could probably say, yeah, I could also see how this drawing or this painting could be sad. Is this painting also happy? What about angry? Where are these kids' brains, eh? Very imaginative. And even though what I'm going to show you now is not part of my original research, I came across this example which really struck me. And it illustrates a similar phenomenon of how children add visual narrative even when they're drawing from observation. This was a still life that was set up in a preschool, and the children were invited to draw using felt pens whenever they like, looking at the still life. And these preschool children came up with a number of different renditions of this. This example, which I find is really beautiful, and in fact, if I had it, I'd have it on my wall. It's stunning. And what I like about it is the way that the child appropriated the blue of the background from the actual still life, or this display, to the vase itself. He ignored the plinth and focused instead on the flowers in the vase. He textured the vase with a freedom of stroke that burst outside the outline of the vase itself. He captured the movement of the flowers in kind of a dancing, kind of stem-like way. And he colored the blossoms gray so that emphasis is given to the pen stroke and the composition. Now, such qualities are what Picasso, Kandinsky, Miro, and Klee tried to recapture in their own artworks as adults. Picasso once said, "It took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child." Look at these. Same still life. Where are these kids' heads, right? They created all sorts of things that were additional to what's going on, right? They used aesthetic things like balance, color, pattern, framing, enveloping, to make it more than just the artwork itself. They used symbolism, like in the top right-hand side one, where you've got a red heart in the sky, and that heart split to be wings on the side of the plinth, or an environmental setting, where you've got things like the sun and the clouds and the rain. So what I want to sort of sum up in a sense about all of this work, or if we were to say the findings of this research, is that art making and responding combines these semiotic systems where they're crossing through these different modalities. Talk, drawing, and movement are parallel and mutually transformative processes. They enrich and they inform each other. Cross-modal meaning making is a constructive process of thinking in action. It's an integrated language, so to speak. Children draw pictures and tell a story at the same time. They act a role, and they create their lines as they go. I want to again read one full transcript by this girl who's 8.5 years old to give you the essence of the sensuous and emotional quality of this work. "I'm drawing the grass in the garden and a rose bush. It's got some roses on it, and I'm picking flowers, and I've got some nice ferns. I'm going to draw myself when I get big. I'm old. It's a walking stick. I'm about 59. And this is Brooke. She's old like me. We've been friends forever. She's got long brown hair, long curly hair blowing out everywhere, right? Out to enjoy the world. Brooke has got a blue tracksuit. Now I'll draw a dog with a bone because I like its bone. He likes its bone. The dog is gold. It's a golden dog, so I'll draw it yellow. And I'm going to draw a fish pond because I like to keep fish. We've got some purple fish, some red fish, and a multicolored fish. And the cover of the fish pond is made out of clear glass so you can see through it to see all the fishes. And the red fish is putting its head up to say hello. We're in the country, and we've got some horses in the paddock, and my horse is called Star, and Brooks is called King. Winter's almost over, but there's some blue sky, and it's early in the morning. And it's colder in the morning, I guess, so that's why I need my tracksuit. There's some maroon sky. I think I have to draw some red in the clouds so that it's the sun making them bright. The sun is making the colorful sky. We didn't like the city. It was too noisy, so we moved from the city to the country. And we just wanted to go back there, because that was the way our life was meant to be. We only get up early once a week, otherwise we don't get enough sleep. I'll call this peaceful morning because there's quiet in the country, and it's so beautiful in the peace and quiet. So what I'm trying to say here is that when children project themselves into their artwork such as this, they combine their everyday experiences with their imagination and their projective reflective state. This type of thinking and feeling involves representation using signs that stand in for specific features or states of affairs. When they draw themselves as, say, a fairy, right, or other fantasy creatures, they are not just pretending to be another. They are acting as if they have imagined characteristics, agency, and a range of identities. The capacity to play with ideas like this is highly significant for children's exploration of possible selves and identities. Children empathetically position themselves in relation to others and manipulate the feelings, the moods, and mind states of their drawn characters, whether they're real or fictional. Engagement with the symbol system of art should be central to how, and is central to how we conceptualize teaching and learning for all students, not because it improves learning, but because it is learning. Art is embodied experience through action. So coming full circle for where I started with this lecture, art is one of the oldest and most fundamental forms of human expression and communication. At its core, art is embodied experience through action, which is a form of intelligence that underpins all other forms of reasoning. Through art, children demonstrate foundational ways of understanding symbols. Children's fluidity in using symbols for expressive and communication is fundamental to their ways of being. Art is much more than a frill or a means for enriching learning. Art is a distinct way of thinking, feeling, and knowing. Young children who have not yet learned to read and write can use art in very accomplished ways. They use what Vygotsky called first-order symbolism fluidly across modes. The act of representing thought and action while drawing actually strengthens children's later understanding of numeracy and literacy. Almost every child can draw frequently and with great skill in their early years. These systems often become de-emphasized, however, in favor of the serious business of learning in schools, learning in 3 R's. This image here, to me, is a metaphor of arts education within the schooling process. We should not expect children to perform only in standardized, measurable ways. There must be sufficient time to engage with authentic learning stemming from children's constructive thinking through graphic, embodied, and narrative ways. We should sit with children and notice the worlds that they create, savoring and preserving the wonders that they are discovering. Why? To develop professional knowledge about children's thinking and knowing, and to lead to pedagogies and curricula that are matched with the potentials and the abilities of the child. A famous quote by Bertolt Brecht is, "Art is not a mirror held up to society, but a hammer with which to shape it." And although this visual here by Gan Wilson is perhaps rather flippant illustration of that concept, the aim is to metaphorically illustrate that art does not simply depict the familiar aspects of life. As Bell Hooks says, another function of art is that it defamiliarizes our understanding of ourselves. Art can propel people to look at something in a new way, which is critical for social change. The arts honor the significance of symbols and the important role that symbols play in reflecting the ideologies of communities. The arts highlight the fluidity of time through generations, where individuals are bound together by cultural processes such as belief systems, mores, traditions, institutions, customs, and values. And the arts still reward creative engagement and communicative, meaningful truths that are eloquent, that no other media can present or allow. This is why the arts deserve a preeminent place in education and culture. Thank you.